Why did the United States, one of the world's most powerful nations, lose the Vietnam War? Was it due to military missteps, political miscalculations, or something more complex? Welcome back to Armchair Archaeology, where today we're exploring the 10 key reasons behind America's defeat in Vietnam. From guerrilla tactics in the unforgiving jungles to domestic opposition and Cold War tensions, each factor played a vital role. And be sure to stay until the end. We'll reveal a surprising lesson from this war that still influences U.S. military strategy today. So, what led to this historic defeat? Let's dive in. One of the primary reasons the U.S. struggled in Vietnam was the relentless guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. The dense, jungle-covered terrain was their greatest ally, giving them a tactical advantage that the U.S. military, designed for conventional warfare, was unprepared to counter. The Viet Cong could launch ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks, then vanish into the jungle or retreat into a vast network of underground tunnels, such as the Cu Chi tunnels. These tunnels allowed them to transport weapons, plan attacks, and live undetected right under U.S. forces. The American military, relying on helicopters, advanced weaponry, and airstrikes, found it nearly impossible to locate and engage an enemy that moved quickly, blended with the local population, and knew the terrain intimately. Search and destroy missions often led to temporary victories, but the guerrilla forces would quickly reclaim lost territory once U.S. troops left the area. What made this style of warfare particularly challenging for the U.S. was the lack of clear battlefronts. Unlike traditional wars, where territory gained or lost is a measure of success, guerrilla warfare was about endurance and attrition. The U.S., unfamiliar with this type of asymmetrical conflict, struggled to adapt. In the end, the terrain and tactics of the Viet Cong neutralized America's technological and logistical advantages, making it impossible to secure a decisive victory. Another major miscalculation by the U.S. was underestimating the sheer determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. While the U.S. saw the war as a battle to stop the spread of communism, the North Vietnamese viewed it as a war for national liberation, a continuation of their long struggle for independence. First against the French, and now against the Americans. Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, was a symbol of this fight for independence, and his people were willing to endure immense suffering to achieve it. The North Vietnamese had already proven their resolve in their war against French colonial forces, and they carried this same spirit into the conflict with the U.S. The idea of national reunification and independence was not just a political goal, it was a deeply personal mission for many Vietnamese. No amount of U.S. firepower or technology could dampen that resolve. Meanwhile, U.S. soldiers served one-year tours of duty, rotating in and out of the conflict. This rotation system created a lack of continuity, with soldiers often disconnected from the long-term objectives of the war. In contrast, the North Vietnamese soldiers were fighting for their homes, their families, and their future, giving them an emotional and psychological edge that the U.S. forces couldn't match. This deep commitment to the cause, combined with the long-term presence of North Vietnamese forces, meant they were willing to absorb high casualties and outlast the U.S. presence. The U.S. misjudged this resolve and failed to understand that they were up against a highly motivated opponent fighting for a cause much deeper than ideology. While the U.S. military fought battles in the jungles of Vietnam, another war was being waged back home, one for the hearts and minds of the American public. For the first time in history, the brutal realities of war were broadcast directly into people's living rooms via television. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and civilian casualties brought the horrors of the conflict into sharp focus for the American public. The war soon lost the abstract sense of distance that had defined earlier conflicts, and public opinion began to shift. Anti-war protests erupted across the country, spearheaded by students, civil rights leaders, and veterans returning from Vietnam, disillusioned by the conflict. One of the most tragic examples of this unrest was the Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen during a protest. The protests were a symptom of a much larger issue. Americans were beginning to question the purpose and morality of the war. As public discontent grew, so did pressure on the U.S. government. President Lyndon Johnson, initially determined to win the war, saw his popularity plummet. His successor, Richard Nixon, faced mounting demands to end the conflict. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception, especially after the 1968 Tet Offensive, which, despite being a military failure for the North Vietnamese, shocked Americans with its scale and ferocity. This growing anti-war movement weakened the U.S.'s ability to sustain its war effort. Domestic unrest, combined with falling troop morale, meant that the American government had to contend with both an unwinnable war abroad and an increasingly hostile public at home. This loss of public support made it impossible for the U.S. to continue fighting indefinitely. A fundamental reason behind America's failure in Vietnam was a deep misunderstanding of the true nature of the conflict. For U.S. policymakers, the war was framed almost exclusively as part of the global Cold War struggle to contain the spread of communism. This lens distorted their perception of what was truly at stake for the Vietnamese people, particularly the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, who saw the war as a fight for national independence and unification. Vietnam had a long history of resisting foreign domination, first by China, then by France, and briefly by Japan during World War II. Ho Chi Minh and his supporters, who had already fought and won a war of independence against the French, viewed the U.S. not as liberators, but as the latest in a series of foreign occupiers. For many Vietnamese, the war wasn't about communism versus capitalism, but rather about self-determination and the removal of foreign influence from their land. American leaders failed to appreciate the powerful nationalistic forces driving the North Vietnamese cause. The assumption was that North Vietnam was simply a pawn in the larger communist movement led by the Soviet Union and China. In reality, the Vietnamese had their own historical motivations, shaped by decades of colonial oppression and a fierce desire for reunification. This misreading of the conflict led the U.S. to employ strategies that were ineffective against a deeply committed and ideologically driven opponent. By failing to recognize the war as a nationalist and anti-colonial struggle, U.S. military and political efforts were misdirected, contributing to the eventual defeat. The U.S. military's search and destroy strategy became one of the most infamous aspects of the Vietnam War, and it was a significant reason behind America's inability to achieve victory. The basic idea was to send U.S. troops into enemy territory, locate the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces, and inflict as much damage as possible before pulling out. These missions were designed to weaken the enemy through sheer attrition. Body counts were the primary metric of success. However, this strategy was fundamentally flawed. The Viet Cong and NVA didn't fight on traditional battlefields. They were guerrilla fighters who could easily slip away after an engagement. U.S. forces would sweep through villages and dense jungles, destroy enemy forces and leave, only for the Viet Cong to reoccupy the area as soon as the Americans withdrew. This led to a frustrating cycle of temporary victories with no lasting territorial control. One of the biggest flaws of search and destroy was its overemphasis on body counts. U.S. military leaders reported inflated numbers to show progress, but these numbers didn't reflect the true state of the war. Killing Viet Cong fighters did little to diminish their overall capability or morale, and the tactic failed to address the root causes of the conflict. Additionally, the destruction caused by these operations often alienated the South Vietnamese civilian population, driving many into the arms of the Viet Cong. Villages destroyed during these missions left people with little choice but to support the North Vietnamese forces. In the end, the strategy did more harm than good, contributing to America's failure to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in January 1968, marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. Not because it was a military success for the North, but because of its profound psychological impact on both the American public and leadership. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was traditionally a time of ceasefire, and US and South Vietnamese forces were caught off guard by a massive, coordinated series of attacks on over 100 cities and outposts throughout South Vietnam. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. They suffered massive casualties, and their offensive was repelled across nearly all fronts. However, the very fact that the North Vietnamese were able to launch such a widespread and audacious attack was a shock to the American public. Up until that point, US officials had assured the public that victory was near and that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. The scale and ferocity of the Tet Offensive shattered this illusion. Television broadcasts of the US Embassy in Saigon being attacked, along with images of intense urban fighting in cities like Hue, shook Americans' faith in the government's optimistic reports. Even though US forces eventually regained control, the psychological damage was done. Public opinion in the US turned sharply against the war, and political support for continued involvement eroded rapidly. President Lyndon Johnson, faced with widespread dissent and a nation increasingly opposed to the war, announced shortly after Tet that he would not seek re-election. The offensive exposed the deep disconnect between what the US government was saying and the reality on the ground, making it a critical turning point in the war's trajectory. A major contributing factor to America's defeat in Vietnam was the instability and corruption within the South Vietnamese government. The US had invested heavily in building South Vietnam into a stable, pro-Western state, but its leadership, particularly under President Ngo Dinh Diem, was deeply flawed. Diem's regime, which ruled from 1955 until his assassination in 1963, was marked by cronyism, repression, and a growing disconnection from the needs and desires of the South Vietnamese people, particularly the Buddhist majority who faced persecution under Diem's Catholic-dominated government. After Diem's assassination, South Vietnam was plagued by political instability, with a series of military juntas and weak civilian governments taking power, each more corrupt and ineffectual than the last. This corruption eroded public trust and made it difficult for the US to maintain popular support for the South Vietnamese government. For many South Vietnamese, the government was seen as a puppet of the US, rather than a legitimate force for independence or stability. Corruption also extended into the South Vietnamese military. Officers often pocketed money meant for their troops, leaving soldiers poorly equipped and demoralized. Desertions were common, and the loyalty of the South Vietnamese forces was always in question. Many soldiers lacked the motivation to fight for a government that seemed more interested in maintaining its own power than in defending the country. The instability and corruption within the South Vietnamese government made it nearly impossible for the US to build a strong, capable ally to stand against the North Vietnamese. This lack of a credible and effective government partner significantly undermined America's efforts to achieve a lasting victory. The Vietnam War unfolded in the larger context of the Cold War, and these geopolitical realities severely limited the US's ability to act decisively. While America's primary goal was to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, it was also acutely aware of the risks of provoking a wider conflict with China or the Soviet Union, both of which supported North Vietnam. This concern placed significant constraints on U.S. military strategy. One of the key fears was that a full-scale invasion of North Vietnam or strikes on supply routes in Laos and Cambodia would provoke China to intervene directly, much like it had during the Korean War in 1950. The memory of that conflict, where U.S. forces were drawn into a prolonged and bloody struggle after China's intervention, weighed heavily on American leaders. As a result, the U.S. was reluctant to escalate the conflict beyond South Vietnam, despite the fact that the North Vietnamese were receiving substantial support from both China and the Soviet Union. These constraints often forced the U.S. to fight with one hand tied behind its back. While bombing campaigns targeted North Vietnam, American ground forces were largely confined to operations within South Vietnam. The U.S. also had to carefully manage its relationships with its NATO allies, many of whom were critical of the war, further limiting America's options. The fear of triggering a broader Cold War confrontation made it difficult for the U.S. to fully leverage its military power. North Vietnam, aware of these geopolitical constraints, was able to exploit them to its advantage, knowing that the U.S. would avoid actions that risked sparking a global conflict. This delicate balancing act was a significant reason why the U.S. couldn't achieve total victory in Vietnam. The official end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam came with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973. These accords, negotiated between the U.S., North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, were intended to bring about a ceasefire and pave the way for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. However, the agreement was fraught with problems from the beginning, and it ultimately failed to establish lasting peace in the region. The U.S. agreed to withdraw its combat forces from Vietnam, but the North Vietnamese forces remained in control of significant portions of South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong continued to operate in many areas. Although the accords brought a temporary halt to open hostilities, the fighting resumed not long after U.S. forces left. Without American military support, the South Vietnamese government was left vulnerable to the North's continued offensives. In April 1975, just 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal, North Vietnamese forces launched a final, overwhelming assault on South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, on April 30th, 1975, marked the official end of the war. The chaotic evacuation of U.S. personnel from the American embassy, with helicopters lifting the last Americans off the rooftop, became one of the most iconic images of the war's conclusion. The failure of the Paris Peace Accords and the subsequent collapse of South Vietnam underscored the futility of America's efforts to secure a stable, pro-Western government in the region. The fall of Saigon and the unification of Vietnam under communist control marked the end of nearly 2 decades of U.S. involvement, leaving a lasting impact on American foreign policy and military strategy. The Vietnam War left a deep and lasting imprint on the United States, both in terms of its military strategy and its political and social landscape. One of the most important lessons learned from the conflict was the recognition that overwhelming military power alone is not enough to win wars, particularly when facing a determined and ideologically motivated enemy. This lesson has had a profound impact on U.S. military strategy in the decades since, influencing its approach to conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. The Vietnam War also gave rise to the concept of Vietnam Syndrome, a term used to describe America's reluctance to engage in prolonged military interventions after the trauma and failures of Vietnam. For years after the war, US policymakers were wary of becoming involved in conflicts that might drag on without a clear path to victory, fearing a repeat of the Vietnam experience. Socially and politically, the war deeply divided the American public. The anti-war movement, fueled by disillusionment with the government's handling of the conflict, led to widespread protests and a loss of trust in political institutions. The war also sparked debates about the role of the media in shaping public opinion, as television coverage of the conflict played a crucial role in turning public sentiment against the war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. serves as a solemn reminder of the human cost of the conflict, with the names of more than 58,000 Americans who lost their lives engraved on its black granite wall. The legacy of Vietnam continues to influence American foreign policy, military strategy, and public attitudes toward war, making it one of the most important and controversial chapters in modern U.S. history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the reasons behind America's defeat in Vietnam. As promised, here's the surprising lesson. Vietnam didn't just change how wars are fought, it transformed U.S. military strategy for good. The realization that overwhelming force can't guarantee success against a determined, ideologically motivated enemy continues to shape U.S. military doctrine today, from Iraq to Afghanistan. The lessons of Vietnam about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding local contexts remain deeply relevant. If you found this exploration insightful, please support Armchair Archaeology by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest historical explorations. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What other historical conflicts should we cover? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the truth of the past.